President, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real honor for me to take the floor in this conference on building capacity for the future. We, from the European Commission, we strongly believe that foundations play a key role in supporting research and innovation in order to address the societal challenges which we are facing as mankind on a worldwide scale, on the European scale, but we also need the support to remain competitive. Since we believe that the foundations play such an important role, we have commissioned a study from the Amsterdam University to find out what happens in terms of foundations at the European level. And surprisingly, not very many facts exist today as regards the role of foundations in supporting research and innovation in Europe. So we have ordered this study, which should cover all member states except Croatia, which was not a member when we ordered this study, and Norway and Switzerland. The aim of this study was to find out how much to quantify and assess the foundation's financial support and policies for research and innovation in Europe, so about the financial support these foundations are providing, make a comparative analysis between the member states and Norway and Switzerland as regards this support, and finally, to identify trends and the potential for future developments in this sector. I would like now to share some of the key findings of this study with you. The first thing, which was not so easy, was to find out how many foundations exist and who of these foundations really provide strong input to research and innovation. So this study has identified more or less 13,000 foundations, out of which about 1,600 have quite a strong emphasis on research and innovation support, but this does not mean that the other foundations also partially provide support for research and innovation, but we have concentrated on these 1,600 foundations. So the picture we will present to you is not a complete one, still it gives a good estimate of what kind of support is provided by foundations to support research and innovation. Please also mind that we have not received feedback from all these research and innovation foundations. Now, what is the state of play in terms of financial facts and figures? The first thing is that about 1,134 foundations have an income of 80 billion euros, about 1,052, and the difference of foundations here is due to the fact that we have not received figures for all these foundations. The assets are 127 billion, and what is key is that the total expenditure in 2012 of these foundations, 1,117, was 10 billion euros. Now, all these 10 billion euros were not exclusively spent on research and innovation. If one only takes research and innovation, it's about 5 billion per year, which is spent within the European member states, Switzerland and Norway, for research and innovation. This is quite an important amount if you consider that, for example, under Horizon 2020, the new framework program for research and innovation, we more or less spend annually about 10 billion euros. So half of these amounts, at the minimum, are spent by private foundations over Europe. Now, what about the geographical distribution of this funding? And this picture here clearly shows you that there are great diversities when it comes to foundation spending in member states. For me, it does not come as a surprise that the United Kingdom, Germany, and Denmark and Sweden are leading by hosting foundations which support research and innovation. Why does this not come as a surprise to me? Because if you remember, the European Union has as a target that 3% of our GDP is paid for research and innovation. And if you look at those countries who exceed the 3% target or are close to the 3% target, it's exactly the same member state. So apparently, this is a cultural issue that in those member states where already public funding for research and innovation is quite important, also foundations are those who most support research and innovation. The situation is quite bad in some other member states, in particular also in the new member states. Again, this is not surprisingly, because foundations were there only set up after the fall of the wall. Before, in the communist regime, private foundations were not permitted according to law. Now, on what is this money spent for, which is provided by foundations? A distinction in beneficiaries and a distinction regarding the research fields. As regards the beneficiaries, most of the amounts, 55%, are made available for individual researchers. Other important beneficiaries are public higher education institutions that can count on support from almost half of the foundations, 48%, and finally research institutes complete the top three with almost a third, 32% of foundations benefiting them. So far to the beneficiaries. As regards the research fields, medical sciences is the most popular research field amongst foundations. This is true both in number of foundations and in the amount of annual expenditure provided for medical health research. Other popular research areas in number of foundations are the social and behavioral sciences and the natural sciences. In terms of expenditure, the engineering and technology field is also amongst the top three. Now, what are the general recommendations of this study? And I think President Besenbacher has already made allusion to these elements. The first thing is explore synergies by collaboration. I think if you look at what we call the European research area, you see a multitude of actors. In terms of funding, you have the European Union with the framework program Horizon 2020. You have funding of national funding agencies, research funding agencies. You have national, you have regional funding. You have funding from industry. You have funding from foundations. And the challenge which we are facing when we want to create this so-called European research area is to have synergies in doing research all over the place, also and in particular in times of scarce resources. This is not to harmonize the research agenda, but I think we all should aim at having certain synergies in our research agendas, which requires collaboration. The second thing is about, and I think that was a point already mentioned now in the questions by Brent, increase the visibility of research and innovation foundations, create financially resilient foundations, in particularly by increasing the sources of funding. A very important issue, and I think this study very clearly shows that the legal and fiscal systems in the member states are very different when it comes to support and to create and to establish foundations to fund research and innovation. So also there, the issue of coordination, of looking at best practices arises. And finally, a recommendation which is more of a, I would almost say, philosophical nature. Research funding is not only a task of public authorities. It is a task of public authorities. It is also a task of business, but evidently one can ask whether funding for research and innovation should be not based on broader social support. Now, to whom are these recommendations addressed? Evidently, some of these recommendations are for the foundations themselves, in particular regarding increasing the visibility of research and innovation foundations, explore synergies by collaboration, and create financially resilient foundations. Many of these recommendations are for national governments, which is the question of improving the legal and fiscal system, again, exploring synergies by collaboration. I think this is a challenge for all funding levels, be it at the European, national, regional, or level of foundations. For the European Commission, I think the question arises whether we should support networking amongst foundations. I think, and the fact that we have ordered this study really shows that we are interested what happens, in particular, if we see how much funding is provided for by these kind of foundations. So the question as to whether through Horizon 2020 we can support networking of foundations, their research agendas, innovation agendas becomes an issue. Again, explore synergies by collaboration. And also the question arises whether we should stimulate new forms of investments. By the way, this is also a question we might discuss later for foundations. Should we remain within the classical grants, or should new forms of investments, crowdfunding, and all other different elements of financial instruments should also be something to be used by foundations? In conclusion, this foundation supporting research and innovation at the European level is a young and a growing sector. Quite considerable amounts of money are spent for research and innovation. If we take this 5 billion, 4.5 billion go to research. So I think the assumption that most of the foundation is funding what we call basic research, or what we might call basic research, is certainly correct. Also, the distinction between what is research, applied research, what is funding, what is innovation, is quite a point which we need to consider. A skewed landscape of foundations, financially vulnerable foundations most prevalent in periphery and post-communist countries, a very fragmented landscape and variation in research and innovation foundation actively reflect economic and geopolitical conditions and corporate R&D investments, and cross-border giving in Europe to increase investments in R&I. So this is more or less an overview as to the state of play of foundations supporting research and innovation at European level. Maybe this gives you some new elements for the further discussion. Many thanks.